You know the story of 1984, Big Brother, Thoughtcrime, the Ministry of Truth. Room 101, George Orwell's dystopian nightmare about a totalitarian future where the government controls everything, your actions, your words, your very thoughts. A warning about authoritarianism, about surveillance, about the corruption of language and the erasure of truth. Published in 1949, it became one of the most influential novels of the 20th century, a cautionary tale that generations of students have read in classrooms, believing it was about distant dictatorships or possible futures that vigilance could prevent. But what if I told you that Orwell's prophecy was not a warning we heeded? What if the world he described is not a future we avoided, but a present we are living in right now? What if every institution, every technology, every system that governs contemporary life has converged to create exactly what Orwell predicted, not through deliberate conspiracy, but through the inexorable logic of power seeking to perpetuate itself? Today, I am going to show you why 1984 is not science fiction. It is documentary. This is the horror of 1984. And once you see it, you will never look at the world the same way again. George Orwell wrote 1984 in 1948 while dying of tuberculosis on the remote Scottish island of Jura. He was 45 years old, and he knew he was running out of time. The novel was his final attempt to articulate everything he had learned about power, about propaganda, about how societies slide from freedom into tyranny, not through violent revolution, but through the slow erosion of truth and the normalization of control. Orwell had spent years observing totalitarian systems firsthand. He fought in the Spanish Civil War and watched as Stalinist communists systematically betrayed and liquidated their anarchist and socialist allies. He worked for the BBC during World War II, producing propaganda and witnessing how governments manipulate information to shape public perception. He saw how language could be weaponized, how facts could be made to disappear, how people could be trained to accept contradictions without question. 1984 was his attempt to distill these observations into a coherent vision of where unchecked power inevitably leads. The novel is set in Oceania, a superstate that emerged after a global war. The world is divided into three perpetually warring empires: Oceania, Eurasia, and Eastasia. The war is never-ending, and the alliances shift constantly, but the war itself is not meant to be won. It exists to consume resources, to keep populations in a state of fear and scarcity, to justify the endless sacrifices demanded by the party. The party, led by the mysterious Big Brother, controls every aspect of life. The thought police monitor citizens constantly through telescreens that watch and listen at all times. Any hint of dissent, any flicker of independent thought is ruthlessly punished. History is constantly rewritten to conform to the party's current narrative. The Ministry of Truth, where protagonist Winston Smith works, is responsible for altering historical records, newspapers, books, everything, so that the past always supports whatever the party claims in the present. If the party says Oceania has always been at war with Eastasia, then all evidence must be destroyed or altered to reflect that reality, even if last week the party said Oceania was allied with Eastasia. The language of Oceania is Newspeak, a deliberately impoverished version of English designed to make subversive thought literally impossible by eliminating the words needed to express it. The party's slogans encapsulate the logic of totalitarian control. War is peace. Freedom is slavery. Ignorance is strength. These are not merely propaganda. They are functional descriptions of how power operates. War keeps the population unified and obedient. Freedom, the ability to think and act independently, is reframed as a terrifying burden. Ignorance of how the system works is what allows it to maintain strength. Winston Smith, the novel's protagonist, is a minor functionary who begins to question the system. He secretly writes in a diary, a thought crime punishable by death. He begins an affair with Julia, another party member, which is forbidden because personal loyalty must be directed entirely toward the party, not toward other individuals. They rent a room above a shop where they believe they can be free, but they are under surveillance the entire time. Eventually, they are arrested. Winston is taken to the Ministry of Love, where he is subjected to prolonged interrogation and psychological destruction by O'Brien, a high-ranking party member. The interrogation sequences are the philosophical and emotional core of the novel. O'Brien does not merely want Winston to confess or to obey. He wants to break Winston's mind so completely that Winston genuinely believes whatever the party tells him to believe. O'Brien explains that the party seeks power for its own sake, not for any ideological goal or to create a better society. Power is the point. The party does not torture and kill to maintain order. It tortures and kills because domination is the purpose of existence. O'Brien famously tells Winston, "If you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever." This is not hyperbole. It is the party's actual philosophy. Suffering and subjugation are not unfortunate necessities. They are the desired ends. Winston is eventually taken to room 101, where prisoners are confronted with their worst fear. For Winston, it is rats. Faced with the prospect of rats eating his face, he breaks completely and begs that the torture be inflicted on Julia instead. This is the final betrayal, the destruction of the last thing he valued. When he is released, he is a hollow shell. In the novel's devastating final scene, Winston sits in a cafe drinking gin, watching the telescreen, and realizes that he loves Big Brother. He has been completely destroyed and remade. The party has won. The horror of 1984 is not the physical brutality, though there is plenty of that. The horror is the systematic destruction of the individual's ability to perceive reality independently, to trust their own thoughts and memories, to love anyone or anything outside the system. The party does not merely punish dissent. It erases the very possibility of dissent by controlling language, information, and perception so thoroughly that rebellion becomes literally unthinkable. When Orwell published the novel in 1949, readers understood it as a critique of Stalinism and fascism, the totalitarian systems that had just devastated Europe. They assumed it was a warning about dictatorships, about foreign threats, about distant tyrannies. But Orwell intended something more troubling. He was warning about the trajectory of all modern societies, including the democratic ones, about how the tools of control were being developed and normalized even in countries that believed themselves to be free. Orwell's prophecy was not about jackbooted thugs kicking down doors. It was about the slow, bureaucratic, technological, and psychological mechanisms through which power expands until it becomes total. And when you look at the world today, at how societies are actually structured and governed, the parallels are not metaphorical. They are literal. We are living in the world Orwell described. It does not look exactly like Oceania because Orwell was writing in 1948 and could only extrapolate from the technologies and social structures of his time. But the fundamental dynamics, the methods of control, the corruption of language, the surveillance, the perpetual war, the rewriting of history, all of it is operational right now. The prophecy came true, not because anyone deliberately implemented Orwell's novel as a blueprint, but because the logic of power, left unchecked and enabled by technology, inevitably produces these outcomes. Consider surveillance. In 1984, the telescreen is the primary tool of control. It is a device in every home and workplace that simultaneously broadcasts party propaganda and monitors citizens, watching and listening constantly. You can never turn it off. You can never escape its gaze. The thought police use the telescreens to detect any hint of dissent, any facial expression or word that suggests disloyalty. Orwell imagined this as a terrifying, oppressive technology that symbolized totalitarian control. Today, we carry telescreens voluntarily. Smartphones are surveillance devices that track location, record conversations, monitor browsing habits, aggregate data on every action and interaction. Smart TVs, smart speakers, fitness trackers, security cameras, every device is connected, collecting data, feeding it into systems that analyze and predict behavior. Facial recognition technology is deployed in public spaces, identifying individuals in crowds without consent or notification. License plate readers track vehicles. Social media platforms harvest psychological profiles, mapping relationships, beliefs, preferences, vulnerabilities. The difference between Orwell's Telescreen and contemporary surveillance is that we were not forced to adopt these technologies. We chose them. They were sold to us as conveniences, as tools for connection and entertainment and efficiency. And they are convenient. They make life easier in countless ways. But convenience is how control is normalized. The telescreen in 1984 is oppressive because it is imposed by the state. Modern surveillance is more insidious because it is voluntary, decentralized, and so integrated into daily life that opting out is nearly impossible. Try to live without a smartphone. Try to avoid being captured by cameras in public. Try to participate in modern employment, banking, healthcare, or social life without submitting to data collection. You cannot. The infrastructure of contemporary life requires surveillance, and it is so pervasive that most people no longer even think about it. We have internalized the telescreen. The entities conducting surveillance are not only governments. Corporations collect more data than any state intelligence agency ever could. Google knows what you search for, where you go, what you watch. Facebook knows who you interact with, what you believe, what triggers your emotions. Amazon knows what you buy, what you read, what you wish you could afford. This data is aggregated, analyzed, sold, and used to predict and manipulate behavior. Advertising is the most obvious application, but the implications go far beyond convincing you to buy products. Political campaigns use the same data to micro-target messages, exploiting psychological profiles to influence voting. Employers use data to screen applicants. Insurers use it to assess risk and set premiums. Law enforcement uses it to predict crime and identify suspects. Governments purchase data from corporations to conduct surveillance that would be illegal if done directly by the state. The result is a surveillance apparatus more comprehensive than anything Orwell imagined, and it operates with minimal oversight, regulation, or accountability because it is distributed across private entities and justified by the logic of the market. In 1984, surveillance is not just about watching, it is about behavior modification. The knowledge that you are being watched changes how you act, how you speak, even how you think. You self-censor, you conform. You perform loyalty, even when alone, because you can never be certain you are not being monitored. This is the panopticon, the prison design where guards can see all prisoners, but prisoners cannot see the guards, creating a state of constant self-surveillance. Contemporary digital surveillance functions the same way. People curate their social media presence, aware that employers, family, authorities might be watching. Activists encrypt communications, knowing that metadata is collected even when content is not. Students avoid certain searches or websites because schools monitor network activity. The chilling effect is real. Studies show that people change their behavior online when they know they are surveilled, avoiding controversial topics, self-censoring speech, conforming to perceived norms. Surveillance does not require overt enforcement. The awareness of surveillance is sufficient to produce compliance. This is precisely the dynamic Orwell described. The telescreens do not need to catch everyone. They only need to create the belief that anyone might be caught, and people will police themselves. Language control is another core element of Orwell's prophecy. Newspeak is the party's project to systematically eliminate words from the English language so that heretical thoughts become literally inexpressible. If there is no word for freedom, then the concept of freedom cannot be fully articulated or communicated. If all nuance is stripped from language, reducing everything to crude binaries, good or ungood, then complex critical thought becomes impossible. Orwell understood that controlling language is controlling thought because we think in language. Limit the language, and you limit what can be thought. This is not metaphor. Linguistic research supports this. The words available in a language shape how speakers of that language perceive and conceptualize reality. This is called linguistic relativity, and while the strong version, that language entirely determines thought, is debated, the weaker version, that language influences thought, is well established. Modern societies do not have Newspeak in the literal sense, but language is being systematically controlled and manipulated in ways that function similarly. Consider euphemism. Governments and corporations use language to obscure reality and make the unacceptable sound benign. Torture becomes enhanced interrogation. Civilian casualties become collateral damage. Layoffs become right-sizing. Propaganda becomes public relations or strategic communication. Surveillance becomes data collection or security. These are not merely polite circumlocutions. They are deliberate efforts to prevent critical engagement with what is actually happening. When you call torture by a neutral-sounding term, it becomes harder to recognize it as morally unacceptable. When you call mass layoffs right-sizing, it sounds like a rational, even necessary business decision rather than the destruction of livelihoods for profit. Euphemism is a tool of power. It launders the brutal and the exploitative through language. The corruption of language extends to the weaponization of terms through inversion. In 1984, the party names its ministries the opposite of their functions. The Ministry of Truth spreads lies. The Ministry of Peace wages war. The Ministry of Love tortures. This is not mere irony. It is cognitive sabotage. When words are systematically divorced from their meanings, language ceases to be a tool for communication and understanding. It becomes a tool for confusion and control. Contemporary political and corporate discourse is filled with this kind of inversion. Legislation named the Patriot Act expands government surveillance and curtails civil liberties. Laws labeled as defending freedom of speech are used to silence critics. Trade agreements that benefit corporations at the expense of workers and environments are marketed as prosperity and partnership. When language is inverted, it becomes difficult to articulate opposition because the language itself has been colonized by power. You find yourself arguing against things labeled freedom, security, prosperity, not because you oppose those values, but because the labels are lies. And the lie is effective because it puts critics in the position of appearing to oppose the stated goal rather than the actual function. Consider the term fake news. It began as a descriptor for literally fabricated stories presented as journalism, but it was quickly weaponized to mean any reporting that challenges a preferred narrative. Political figures across the spectrum use the term to dismiss inconvenient facts, to delegitimize media scrutiny, to create a permission structure for ignoring information that contradicts their positions. This is Orwellian double plus ungood. The term meant to identify lies is used to obscure truth. Once a term is weaponized in this way, it loses its utility as a descriptor of reality. It becomes a tool of rhetorical combat, and the concept it originally named becomes harder to discuss honestly. This degradation of language is not accidental. It serves power by making coherent critique more difficult. Social media accelerates the corruption of language through the flattening of discourse into slogans, memes, and hashtags. Complex ideas are reduced to sound bites. Nuance is punished by algorithms that reward engagement, which means outrage, simplicity, tribalism. The most shared content is the most emotionally charged and the least intellectually rigorous. This is not because people are stupid. It is because the platforms are designed to maximize attention, and attention is captured by triggering emotional responses, not by fostering thoughtful dialogue. The result is a linguistic environment where depth is disadvantaged, and where language functions more as tribal signaling than as communication. You declare your allegiances through the phrases you use, the hashtags you deploy, the memes you share. Language becomes a marker of identity rather than a tool for describing reality. This is Newspeak by another name. The vocabulary is not formally restricted, but the dynamics of the platform restrict what kinds of speech are effective, shaping language use in ways that serve the platform's interests, not the user's capacity for critical thought. The rewriting of history is another of Orwell's central concerns. In 1984, the Ministry of Truth continuously alters historical records to align with the party's current positions. If the party changes its stance on an issue, all documents are retroactively changed so that the party appears to have always held its current position. The past is literally rewritten, and the original records are destroyed. This is not merely propaganda. It is the erasure of the past as an independent source of truth. When history can be endlessly revised, there is no stable ground from which to challenge the present. The party's slogan is, "Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past." This is the logic of totalitarianism. If you can control the narrative of history, you can control what people believe is possible, what they believe is inevitable, what they believe is natural. Contemporary societies do not send functionaries to physically alter printed newspapers and archives, but the rewriting of history happens constantly through digital manipulation and narrative control. Online content can be edited, deleted, or buried by algorithms with no trace of the original. Social media platforms alter past posts, adjust what is visible, remove content retroactively. Digital journalism is edited after publication, often without clear indication that changes were made. Search engines prioritize certain sources and bury others, shaping what information is accessible. Wikipedia, while valuable, is editable, and controversial topics are battlegrounds where competing factions fight to control the narrative. The internet, far from being a permanent and objective record, is fluid and contested, subject to manipulation by those with the technical skills and the resources to shape it. The manipulation is not always deliberate. Algorithmic curation, designed to show users what they are most likely to engage with, creates filter bubbles where people are exposed primarily to information that confirms their existing beliefs. This is not censorship in the traditional sense, but it functions as a form of passive control, where the range of accessible perspectives is invisibly narrowed. Over time, this shapes not only what individuals believe, but what they believe is believable. If you are only ever exposed to sources that support one narrative, alternative narratives begin to seem implausible, even delusional. This is how consensus is manufactured not through overt suppression, but through the quiet architecture of information ecosystems. Historical narrative is also controlled through the framing of events, the selection of what is remembered, and what is forgotten. Inconvenient facts are not necessarily denied. They are simply omitted, ignored, or contextualized in ways that neutralize their critical potential. Atrocities committed by one's own nation are downplayed or justified. Heroic resistance movements in enemy states are celebrated, while similar movements at home are demonized. The narratives taught in schools, repeated in media, commemorated in holidays and monuments, construct a version of history that serves power. This is not unique to any one country or political system. All nations do this, but the scale and sophistication of narrative control in the digital age are unprecedented. The past is not rewritten with the crude obviousness of Orwell's Ministry of Truth. It is curated, contextualized, algorithmically prioritized, and selectively amplified until the version of history that serves power is the version that is most accessible, most repeated, most believed. Perpetual war is another key element of 1984. Oceania is always at war, but the war is not meant to be won. It is a tool of control. War consumes resources that might otherwise improve living standards, keeping the population in a state of scarcity and dependence. War creates external enemies, unifying the population and justifying the suppression of dissent. War normalizes emergency powers and the erosion of civil liberties. And war is profitable for those who control the production of weapons and the apparatus of the military. The actual conflict, the soldiers dying, the cities bombed, is almost irrelevant. The war itself is the point. It perpetuates the system. The United States has been at war continuously for decades. Since 2001, the war on terror has been used to justify invasions, occupations, drone strikes, indefinite detention, torture, mass surveillance, and the militarization of domestic law enforcement. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq were justified with lies, prosecuted at enormous cost in lives and resources, and resulted in chaos and suffering with no coherent endpoint or achievable victory. But the wars continue in different forms, in different countries, under different justifications. Yemen, Somalia, Syria, Libya. The war is everywhere and nowhere, an endless conflict against an enemy defined so broadly, terrorism, that it can never be defeated. This is Orwell's Perpetual War made real. The conflict is not designed to be won. It is designed to sustain a military-industrial complex that profits from war, to justify surveillance and authoritarianism, to keep the population afraid and obedient. The language around war mirrors Newspeak. Invasions are called liberations. Bombings are called surgical strikes, as if war can be clinical and precise, as if cities can be destroyed with the accuracy of a scalpel. Civilian deaths are collateral damage, a term that turns human beings into accounting errors. The war on terror itself is Orwellian language. Terror is an emotion, a tactic. You cannot make war on a tactic. But the deliberate vagueness of the term allows the war to expand indefinitely, to justify action anywhere, against anyone designated as a terrorist or a terrorist sympathizer or a threat to national security. The definitions are elastic, the criteria secret, the targets determined by executive authority with minimal oversight. This is war as a permanent condition, war as the organizing principle of society, war as the justification for everything the state does. The economic structure of perpetual war also mirrors Orwell's insight. Defense contractors, private military companies, surveillance firms, technology corporations that service the military, all profit immensely from the continuation of conflict. There is an entire industry dependent on war, and that industry has enormous influence over policy. Politicians receive donations from defense contractors. Military officers retire into lucrative positions in the private sector. The revolving door ensures that those making decisions about war have personal financial incentives to continue it. The wars do not need to succeed at their stated goals. They only need to continue. And they do. Perpetual war is not a bug in the system. It is the system functioning as designed. The destruction of privacy and the normalization of total visibility are also central to Orwell's vision. In 1984, there are no private spaces. Even in their supposedly secret room, Winston and Julia are being watched. Privacy is a threat to the party because private space is where dissent could be imagined, where relationships could form that are not mediated by the state, where individuals could remember who they are outside the roles assigned to them. The elimination of privacy is the elimination of the individual. When everything is visible, when all behavior is monitored, people cease to be autonomous beings with inner lives and become merely performers of obedience. Contemporary society has largely accepted the elimination of privacy, not through overt coercion, but through the gradual normalization of surveillance, the convenience of connected devices, the cultural shift toward public performance of identity. Social media encourages the constant broadcast of personal life. Privacy settings are complex, frequently changed, often ignored. Younger generations raised in this environment often express bewilderment at the idea that privacy matters, that there might be value in keeping aspects of life unseen. The attitude is, if you have nothing to hide, why would you care about surveillance? This is exactly the attitude that enables totalitarian control. The assumption that privacy is only valuable to those engaged in wrongdoing inverts the moral logic. Privacy is not about hiding bad behavior. It is about preserving autonomy, about maintaining a space where you can think and feel and exist without being subject to judgment, monetization, or state scrutiny. The argument that privacy does not matter if you are not doing anything wrong ignores that what counts as wrong is determined by those in power and can change at any time. Laws change, governments change, norms change. Information collected today under one set of rules can be used tomorrow under different rules. Data does not expire. It is permanent, and it can be weaponized. Dissidents, activists, journalists, whistleblowers, anyone who challenges power can have their data used against them. Not only through legal prosecution, but through targeted harassment, doxing, intimidation. The capacity for total surveillance creates total vulnerability, and vulnerability creates compliance. The digital age has created another mechanism of control that Orwell could not have foreseen, but that fits perfectly within his framework: addiction. Social media platforms, video streaming services, mobile games, endless scrolling feeds, all are designed using behavioral psychology to maximize engagement, which is a euphemism for addiction. The platforms employ the same techniques that casinos use to keep gamblers playing: variable reward schedules, infinite content, notifications that trigger dopamine releases, interfaces designed to minimize friction and maximize compulsion. This is not accidental, it is intentional. The business model of these platforms depends on capturing and holding attention. The more time users spend on the platform, the more data is collected, the more ads can be served, the more profit is generated. User well-being is irrelevant to this logic. What matters is engagement. The result is a population that is distracted, fragmented, anxious, and unable to focus for extended periods. Attention spans have measurably decreased. The capacity for deep reading, for sustained thought, for contemplation without interruption, is eroding. This is catastrophic for democratic citizenship, for critical thinking, for the ability to engage with complex ideas. When your attention is constantly hijacked, when you are perpetually distracted, you cannot think deeply. You react rather than reflect. You consume rather than analyze. This is not a side effect of technology. It is the desired outcome for those who profit from your attention. A distracted, addicted population is easier to manipulate, easier to control, less capable of organizing resistance. Orwell's telescreens broadcast propaganda. Contemporary screens do that too, but they also function as attention traps, cognitive colonizers, tools for fragmenting consciousness itself. The horror is not just that we are watched. It is that we are made incapable of thinking clearly about being watched. The concept of doublethink is one of Orwell's most powerful and disturbing insights. Doublethink is the ability to hold two contradictory beliefs simultaneously and accept both as true. It is not mere hypocrisy, where you say one thing and believe another. It is the actual internalization of contradiction. In 1984, party members practiced doublethink constantly. They know the party's statistics are lies, but they believe them. They know history has been rewritten, but they accept the new version as having always been true. This cognitive dissonance is necessary for the system to function, because the system is built on contradictions. War is peace. Freedom is slavery. Ignorance is strength. These are not paradoxes to be resolved. They are commands to accept the impossible, to abandon logic, to surrender the mind's insistence on consistency. Doublethink is everywhere in contemporary life. Citizens of democratic nations proclaim their commitment to freedom while accepting mass surveillance that would have been unimaginable a generation ago. They express concern about corporate power while voluntarily surrendering their most intimate data to corporations that monetize and weaponize that information. They claim to value privacy while broadcasting their lives continuously on social media platforms designed to extract and exploit every detail of their existence. They know climate change is an existential threat, requiring systemic transformation, but continue patterns of consumption that accelerate environmental collapse. They recognize wealth inequality as fundamentally unjust, but support or accept economic policies that increase concentration of wealth and power. This is not stupidity or ignorance. It is doublethink. People are capable of knowing something and not knowing it at the same time, of believing contradictory things, of functioning within systems they intellectually recognize as harmful, because the cognitive and emotional labor of sustaining consistent resistance is exhausting, isolating, and appears futile. Doublethink is how people survive in conditions where reality is intolerable but inescapable. It is a coping mechanism that allows individuals to navigate systems of control without going insane from the contradiction. And it is the mechanism through which totalitarian logic embeds itself not through external force, but through internal capitulation. The most disturbing aspect of doublethink is that it is rational given the constraints people face. To live with full awareness of the surveillance, the manipulation, the exploitation, the lies, would be psychologically unbearable and practically paralyzing. What would you do with that awareness? Where would you go? How would you live outside the systems that structure everything from employment to healthcare to social connection? The infrastructure of modern life is totalizing. There is no outside. And so people adapt. They know and do not know. They see and do not see. They participate in their own subjugation because the alternative, total refusal, is not survivable. This is the perfection of control. You do not need guards and guns at every corner if you can create conditions where compliance is the only viable option and then train people to not consciously acknowledge that this is what they are doing. The party in 1984 does not claim to make people happy. It openly admits that its purpose is power for its own sake, domination as an end in itself. O'Brien tells Winston that the future is a boot stamping on a human face forever, and he means it. But contemporary systems of control are more sophisticated. They claim to serve freedom, prosperity, security, progress. They do not present themselves as authoritarian. They present themselves as liberating. Surveillance is sold as convenience and safety. Corporate data extraction is framed as personalized service. Algorithmic manipulation is marketed as curation and recommendation. The erosion of privacy is portrayed as the natural evolution of a connected world. Perpetual war is justified as defense of liberty. The destruction of labor power is called flexibility and innovation. Inequality is presented as meritocracy. The language is inverted so thoroughly that people defend the systems that exploit them, using the rhetoric of empowerment and choice. This is where contemporary control surpasses Orwell. The party in 1984 maintains power through naked brutality and the constant threat of violence. Everyone knows they are oppressed. They comply out of fear. But in contemporary societies, people are induced to participate willingly, even enthusiastically, in systems of control because those systems are wrapped in the language of freedom and presented as voluntary. You choose to carry a smartphone. You choose to use social media. You choose to accept terms of service that sign away your rights. The choice is largely illusory. The alternative is exclusion from economic and social life. But the illusion matters. It launders domination through consent. And because you chose or appear to have chosen, resistance becomes a personal failure rather than a systemic problem. If you are unhappy, if you feel surveilled, if you feel manipulated, that is your fault for making bad choices, for being paranoid, for not managing your relationship with technology responsibly. The system absolves itself by making domination a matter of individual consumer choice. The convergence of all these elements, surveillance, language manipulation, historical revisionism, perpetual war, the destruction of privacy, addiction, doublethink, creates a condition that is functionally Orwellian even if it does not look exactly like Oceania. The aesthetics are different. There is no Big Brother poster. There are no party uniforms. The architecture is not brutalist concrete, but gleaming glass and steel. But the underlying dynamics are the same. Power seeking to perpetuate itself has developed mechanisms of control that are total, not because they are imposed by a single totalitarian state, but because they are distributed across governments, corporations, and technologies that together create an environment where autonomy is systematically eroded, truth is systematically obscured, and resistance is systematically neutralized. This is not a conspiracy. Conspiracies require coordination, secrecy, a small group of actors deliberately engineering outcomes. What we are describing is something more banal and more terrifying. It is the emergent property of systems that optimize for power, profit, and control. Governments want to maintain authority and suppress threats. Corporations want to maximize profit by capturing attention and extracting data. Technologies are designed to be addictive and surveillant because that is what makes them profitable. Media wants engagement, which means outrage and simplicity. Political actors want to win, which means weaponizing information and manipulating perception. None of these actors need to coordinate. They simply need to pursue their own interests within systems that reward domination and penalize restraint. The result is convergence toward Orwellian conditions not because anyone planned it, but because that is where the incentives lead. The logic of power, iterated across institutions and technologies, produces totalitarianism by default. This is why reform is so difficult. There is no single villain to defeat, no policy to change that would solve the problem, no election that would reverse the trajectory. The system is distributed and decentralized. functioning through the accumulated decisions of millions of actors, each rational within their own context, but collectively catastrophic. You cannot boycott your way out of surveillance capitalism. You cannot vote your way out of perpetual war. You cannot individually resist algorithmic manipulation when the entire information ecosystem is structured to exploit cognitive vulnerabilities. Individual resistance is insufficient not because people are weak, but because the systems are comprehensive. They shape the environment within which individual choice occurs, narrowing the range of viable options until compliance is the path of least resistance and resistance becomes effectively impossible. Orwell understood this. The tragedy of Winston Smith is not just that he is broken by torture, it is that he was never going to win. The system is too powerful, too total, too embedded in the fabric of reality. Even before his arrest, even in his moments of rebellion, he was already caught. The diary he wrote was always going to be discovered. The room he rented was always under surveillance. Julia's rebellion was always performance. O'Brien was always a party loyalist setting a trap. There was no escape because there was no outside. The totalitarian system had made itself coterminous with reality itself. And this is the horror that Orwell wanted readers to understand. Totalitarianism is not a dramatic deviation from normalcy that can be resisted by heroic individuals. It is the normalization of domination to the point where it becomes invisible, where it structures the field of possibility so thoroughly that even imagining alternatives becomes difficult. The contemporary world has achieved this. Not through the crude methods of Oceania, but through the sophisticated integration of surveillance, manipulation, distraction, and the illusion of freedom. People are not oppressed by a party. They are managed by systems that are everywhere and nowhere, that have no face, no leader, no headquarters to storm. The power is in the infrastructure, in the algorithms, in the economic incentives, in the architecture of information. And because it is distributed, it is resilient. You cannot overthrow it because there is nothing to overthrow. You can only navigate it, endure it, and hope to carve out small spaces of autonomy in the cracks. Orwell's prophecy came true, not because anyone took 1984 as an instruction manual, but because he understood the trajectory of modernity, the direction that unchecked power and unregulated technology would inevitably take. He saw that surveillance would expand, that language would be weaponized, that truth would be destabilized, that war would be perpetuated, that individuals would be subsumed into systems that value compliance over autonomy. He wrote 1984 not to describe a distant totalitarian regime, but to warn about the totalitarian potentials latent in all modern societies, including and especially the democratic ones, which cloak their mechanisms of control in the rhetoric of freedom and progress. His warning was ignored not because people did not read the book, but because the systems he warned about became too useful, too profitable, too entrenched to resist. The telescreen was accepted. The Newspeak was normalized. The perpetual war was justified. The rewriting of history was automated. The doublethink became habitual. And the boot stamping on the human face forever was rebranded as innovation, security, and user experience. We are living in Orwell's nightmare. Not in a sudden dramatic collapse into overt dictatorship, but in the slow accumulation of controls, each one justified, each one rational within its own context, each one making the next one easier to accept, until the totality of control is so comprehensive that imagining an alternative becomes an act of rebellion in itself. And rebellion, in a world where thought itself is surveilled and language itself is corrupted, and history itself is fluid, becomes almost impossible. This is the horror. Not that we were conquered, but that we built the prison ourselves, brick by brick, click by click, and called it progress. Subscribe to Umbral Fables as we continue to open the forbidden archives and explore the shadows of the myths that built us. This is Umbral Fables. We leave you now, not with comfort, but with questions. Look closely. The dark journey continues.